So I've actually been quite impressed and even a little surprised by how Canadians celebrate holidays. Coming from the United States and coming from a land where a holiday is a reason for a barbecue and a sale at your local department store, I was really struck by, on Remembrance Day, we went down to the cenotaph, this was last year, and the solemnity of the service, the red poppies, for a country that had not been actively at war, although Afghanistan, of course, but for so long, to still have such a connection. And that was so foreign from what I experienced in the United States. We went down to Richmond on July 1st to watch the parade. You guys know how to parade. I say you guys. I'm including myself in that. And even Boxing Day, which I had no idea what that was, and then my credit card told me exactly what it was. So this Monday is Labor Day. I spelled it with an extra U, by the way. So after you fire up your barbecue and put on that last outfit in white for that last time that you can wear white before Labor Day, right? You might also want to polish the mezuzah that hangs on your door, because Labor Day is a Jewish holiday, a very Jewish holiday. Now there's a temptation, I think, amongst all rabbis to justify all calls for social justice and reform through the verse that begins, or is at least at the heart, of this week's Torah portion, Shoftim, Tzedek, Tzedek, Tirdof. In fact, Rabbi David Saperstein says that this is called the justice, justice you shall pursue rationale, which is to say that we are commanded to pursue justice, therefore we must, and insert the social justice endeavor or agenda item into that next line, that we use this parsha to justify so much of what we do in the act of tikkun olam in the world. And while that is true, it is not necessary for Labor Day. Because Labor Day, you want to give the sermon? Okay. I can do that because he's my son. Because Labor Day, when it comes to supporting fair labor practices, Labor Day is at the core of Jewish values. The Torah, the document written to defend is a document actually written to defend the human rights of workers. In Exodus, the commandment to observe the Sabbath day as a day of rest is preceded by the verse, 6 days you shall work, which is interpreted to mean that just as Israel is given the positive commandment of the Sabbath, we are also given the positive commandment of work. Work is a mitzvah, just as rest on Shabbat is a mitzvah. Both work and rest are therefore considered sacred acts. Later, Psalm 128 states it even more succinctly, when you shall eat the labor of your hands, you will be happy, and it shall be well with you. And the Talmud comments on this to say that you shall be happy in this world, and it shall be well with you in the next world. Labor is an ethical commandment, even apart from its practical value. The Jewish celebration of work stood in sharp contrast to the philosophies of the rabbinic and medieval period of the ancient world. Both the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans looked down on labor. What was the goal of a Roman citizen, of a Greek citizen? It was to be freed from labor, to not have to work. A citizen didn't work, but rather slaves and serfs did. According to Aristotle, labor stupefies both mind and body and deprives man of his natural dignity. The title of citizen belongs only to those who need not to work in order to live. Nothing could be further from the Jewish perspective on labor. That's why we're not Greeks and Romans, I guess. In reaction, actually, the Jewish scholars of their day countered to say, love labor, hate mastery, and stay away from the local government. That's what they said. Jews love work. Jews value work. Work is dignity. Work is liberation from oppression. Work is holy. It's a mitzvah. That is, of course, only when work is work and not a form of slavery or oppression. The Haggadah reminds us, the Haggadah from Passover reminds us every year, you, meaning all of us and our ancestors, were once slaves in the land of Egypt. What was the burden of slavery? It was work without dignity. It was work that was oppressive. It was work without sacred purpose and that profaned itself in all respects. Why are we reminded of this? Because we have to be ever watchful and mindful that we don't become slaves again, and even far worse, I would say, that we don't become taskmasters ourselves. A legacy of support for workers' rights is imperative in the Torah and in later rabbinic writings. In fact, many of the Talmudic rabbis, as you go through, rabbis are listed not only by their name but by their occupation. There's Yochanan the shoemaker, and Yitzhak the blacksmith, Shaky the moil. I made that one up. Seeing if you're still awake. They knew the value of labor and had firsthand experience dealing with fairness. It's funny, isn't it? Firsthand experience dealing with fairness in their workplaces. These were not, rabbis like rabbis today who just worked in a shul. Maimonides was a doctor and a lawyer. They were out working, and it is from that the laws of our rabbinic tradition were derived. It's what makes the Talmud so timeless and incredible, because it's really a pragmatic and practical legal text. It was not written in an ivory tower or in a synagogue. It was written in the fields. It was written in the workshops. It was written by workers and field hands who were also rabbis. So listen to some of the things that the Talmud includes about rights of workers. Wages are to be paid at the end of a day's work, and in money, not in goods. I once forgot to pay our housekeeper, and she went home. I wasn't there, and she had already left. And I was driving to synagogue, and her home was in the neighborhood, but not quite on the way to synagogue. And it was a choice. I could either go to her home and drop off the money, which she wasn't expecting necessarily, or I could be late to synagogue, or I could be on time to synagogue. I never felt so good about being late to services when I drove to her home that evening. Landowners are commanded to share their bounty. In the biblical commandment, we know about leaving the corners of your field unreaped, the gleaning of the corners of your field. And employers are commanded to act justly in their treatment of those that they temporarily own on hire, to follow the intention of the law if the letter of the law is not clear or doesn't suffice. This is perhaps, for me, the most powerful argument for why Judaism is such a labor rights-focused tradition. It's the one time in Jewish tradition that I can think of where you set aside the letter of the law for the intention of the law if the letter of the law does not suffice to meet the rights of the workers, knowing that in modernity there are things that change and the letter of the law doesn't always catch up. Our rabbis tried to anticipate all needs, but the Talmud, and I'll share with you a story in a moment, says quite clearly, go with what was intended. Go with the rights of the workers, even if you can't find the proof text in the text. A story from the Talmud that eliminates this. So there were some workers that negligently, broke a barrel of wine belonging to Rabbi, son of Rav Huna. It's like breaking the barrel of wine belonging to the president or the prime minister. Thereupon, Rabbi seized their garments. He took all of their clothes. And so they went to complain to Rav, who was a scholar and a great rabbi. And Rav said, "Return them their garments," he ordered. "Is this the law?" inquired Rabbi, son of Rav Huna. And Rav said, "Even if it isn't the law, it should be. Return their clothes." So their garments having been returned, they observed, but we're poor. These are the workers. We're poor men. We've worked all day and are in need. Are we to get nothing? Are we not to be paid for our labor? Remember, they broke a barrel of wine. They were moving stuff, and they broke a barrel of wine. So they go back to Rav, and Rav says, "Go and pay them." He says this to Rabbah. And Rabbah says, "Is this the law?" And again, Rav says, "If it isn't, it should be. Go and pay them." It's a pretty powerful thing in the context of Talmud. Labor Day is not just about the act of labor, the act of work. It's not just a celebration of work, but rather a serious acknowledgement of the historic imbalance between management and labor, the great strides that labor unions have made to ensure dignity and fairness for those who, by the work of their hands, this nation endures. And what work is not, and that work is not done. We look around our cities and we see that ideal has not yet been met. Vancouver is an expensive city. It takes 2 incomes and a rich uncle to buy a home. The real living wage in Vancouver, what you really need to live on, is more than $20 an hour. BC's child poverty rate is 18.6%, the highest in Canada. And 32% of poor children in British Columbia, 44,500 children, live in families with at least one working parent in the home. So who's responsible for work that does not suffice in order to provide a living wage, a home, enough to feed your children and get them out of poverty? One answer is actually at the end of this week's Torah portion, the one that I began with, that began with Tzedek, Tzedek Tirdof, Parshat Shoftim. But not that line. Later on, at the very end of the Torah portion, there's a story of a murder. Do you remember this from Sunday school? There's a story, it seems to come out of nowhere. There's a story of a murder. The discussion concerns the discovery of a murder victim in the fields between 2 cities. With no evidence on hand, it might be possible for people just to throw up their hands and say, well, we didn't do it, and we didn't do it. It's none of our problems, and they go on about their day. But the Torah says, no, you can't do that. And so what does the Torah say? It demands that instead, the leaders of the nearest city, representing all of its residents, have to go through this quite complex and involved ritual to assume responsibility for the crime and to seek God's forgiveness, even though they could honestly argue, well, it's not in our city, it's in a field between our cities. But by proximity, it is their responsibility. Proximity is responsibility. Presumably, they are inspired to take steps to ensure the safety of residents and strangers alike so that their regret over this murder will not just be a hollow apology. Rabbi Jack Molina observes that workers are most often victimized not in fields between cities, but in that netherworld between competing interests, decentralized corporations and geographically scattered investors. With no one at hand to take responsibility for low wages or inadequate benefits, we might reasonably throw up our hands in all innocence and decry the crime. Oh, it's terrible, but who's responsible? Who could be called? And go on with our lives. Until we take responsibility for our neighbors and strangers alike, seeking for them the very protections from this anonymous neglect that we have not fulfilled, then we have not fulfilled the mandate of Torah. We all know that not every worker is righteous and not every employer is evil and vice versa. But we who live in privilege know the lengths to which we go to provide for ourselves and the ones that we love. We hope to be rewarded for our actions and for our labor, our efforts and our intentions fairly and adequately, whether we meet an ideal of righteousness or not. So we're gathered here this evening to offer thanks and blessing for the blessings of Shabbat. We must earn those blessings by pursuing a just society in which all people can depend on the dignity of their work as a reflection of the purpose for which they were created. In a time when Jews have become managers and professionals and entrepreneurs, it's easy to forget that many Jewish families have benefited from the work of labor unions. In fact, most labor unions were founded by Jews who were living their Torah, not in shul, but in the streets. And it is easier still to think that the work is not yet done, or that that work is done, but it's not. Tzedek, Tzedek Tirdof, our Parsha declares, justice, justice you shall pursue. Why is justice repeated twice? Because that work, the work of justice for the worker, that is work that is never done. From that there is no day off. Shabbat Shalom. Our service continues with Aleinu on page 586. Please rise.